Hi all, welcome to Coding Talks. To give a brief introduction about myself, Vishnu Viji. I am an AWS community builder. I do have a YouTube channel and podcast. The name of the YouTube channel and podcast is Coding Talks with Vishnu Viji. Feel free to listen from convenient platforms as you like. And previously I had a few video sessions as well, which are available in my YouTube channel, and also the podcast is different one, which can be available from different platforms like Spotify, Amazon, or whatever way convenient for you. You can listen from any one of that. It's also available in YouTube as well. Other than that, I am a .NET developer. Working with the different front-end and back-end technologies. Back-end mainly I work with the .NET, Node.js, and front-end mainly I focus on Angular, React. There were also sessions available related to those areas on the episode. Then other than that, the cloud side, I have expertise working with the AWS, Azure, and GCP. So that's all a quick introduction about myself, and the topic of today's discussion is mainly about selecting the right storage class and the importance of selecting the right storage class for your AWS storage. To set the context, I will start with a brief introduction about what AWS service is, and then we will look into the different AWS storage classes available. Some of the management features that are provided by AWS for ensuring the right storage, and also to ensure the compliance and auditing of data. And also we'll also look into the one important compliance related feature of S3, which is called the S3 versioning, which can and object log, which can be used for compliance and other purpose, especially in the context of enterprise. So I'll start with an overview about AWS and AWS S3. And if you look into the AWS console and look into the storage services, there are a couple of different storage services available right there, depending upon the need and how you want your application data to be stored. You can opt for different services. And when it comes to the Windows file system based structure, there is an FSX service available. Then there is an elastic block storage service, which is available for storing virtual machine related or EC2 related data. EC2 is another one virtual machine service available within the AWS. So if you have a set of EC2 instances and you want to have a storage location, then EBS is one of the good choice. It offers persistent storage. By default, the EC2 offers an ephemeral storage, like a temporary storage along with that, which is very fast, and it can be used in some of the cases like caching and other purpose. But if you want a persistent storage, you can opt for the EBS service. Then the Windows FSX service, which we discussed. There are a couple of other services as well. Then when it comes to the focus of this today's episode, that's the S3. It's actually an kind of an object storage where you don't follow any particular hierarchical or kind of a folder like structure or anything. Rather, you have a simple bucket which is one of the fundamental container required in S3. You create a container which is the bucket, and there are certain restrictions because the container is the bucket is the one thing which AWS used to uniquely identify your data. So you can have a lot of buckets for depending upon your application needs, but the bucket name should be unique, and within the bucket you can have unlimited number of objects stored. So when you store an object, say for example an image or a file or something, it will be stored as an object inside S3. there are a couple of other management features as well as other properties that are also offered by AWS in addition to just storing the data. That is called it offers it can hold data plus metadata. That means when you store an object, you can have associated metadata which can be used for your programmatic purpose. By default, AWS also has some metadata there. So whenever you create a bucket and store some data within the S3, by default it goes to the S3 standard, and this is ideally suitable for majority of the use cases. Like if you have an application data or something, S3 will be a convenient choice. But the main thing is like S3, the storage S3 standard. When I say S3 standard, it has a kind of a bit higher storage cost, and also but it's very highly available in the sense like when you store a object in standard mode, what happens is like it will be stored in 3 availability zones. So that means availability zones are independent locations which are connected by high speed lines within AWS, and a couple of different availability zones, like 3 or 4 availability zones together make a data center. So that means that whenever you store something within the S3 and in the default S3 standard, it means that data, the copies of 3, at least the minimum 3 copies will be readily available in different availability zones. Availability zones means different data centers which are around at least 100 miles away from each other, but they are connected with each other through high speed lines. Why, you might be wondering why the need for this, like why storing the multiple copies, and it's mainly for highly available. So that's why the S3 standard is termed as very highly available, and it's very durable as well. That means that whenever you store something there, Amazon ensures that it will be stored there and then it will be replicated across different data centers. By default, it will be replicated across 3 different availability zones. That means even if one availability zone goes wrong, it will be readily available in 2 other different areas. So this is in the case of regional availability. So data and these availability zones are regional, means that it will be available in a single region. If you want to opt for further availability, very high availability, which some applications do require, in majority of cases that's not a must, but depending upon your application requirements, sometimes you need very high availability. Other than this, by default it stores the data in three different availability zones, but if you want more availability, then rather than having a regional availability, you can have multi-region availability, which you can opt from the AWS console. S3, once you create a bucket, then if you click on the properties, then there will be different set of management features which are provided by AWS, and one such thing is called the high availability, where you can have the same bucket some in a different region as well. That means in 2 different regions with different availability zones, your data will remain. That means if by any means, if one data center or one region goes down, then it will still available from another one. That's the case, and because of this kind of high available and durability, its cost a bit high, especially the storage cost and transfer rate is a bit high, but it will be readily available. Then there is one more frequently access storage class available in AWS, which is called the S3 Express On Zone. So when I mentioned previously about the standard, you might be aware that a data on stored in S3 will be readily available within the 3 different availability zones. But in case if you are okay, where you are fine with having data stored just in one zone instead of multiple availability zones, then S3 Express can be used. But why we going for S3 Express rather than S3 standard is that In some cases, enterprises required absolute low latency and high throughput of data, especially the case where real-time stock market or very highly interactive gaming environments where the latency is a very high concern. Then in that case, if you can compromise the high availability to one zone, just one zone, then that's fine. Then you can go for the S3 Express. So as of now, this is one of the very highly high speed, highly low latency service available from S3. Now, not all data needs to be frequently accessible, and there are cases where enterprises have some kind of data which are less frequently accessed. So for that purpose, there are two different storage classes provided by AWS, which is the S3 standard infrequent access or S3 standard -IA. While you create a new bucket, you can find these different classes there. By default, it will be standard. So if you know the pattern of data that you are planning to store, then selecting the right class would be the best one. So if you plan for something like a backup, disaster recovery, or you are creating some buckets for a long-term storage or regulatory or compliance requirements, then the S3 standard infrequent access can be stored for that, and this can also be leveraged for storing something like enterprise financial response reports, or sometimes, say for example, the support call centers need to archive the call recordings after 1 month. Then the bucket specifically for that purpose can be created, where you can store all the call recordings. So that the benefit you are getting, that is like the storage cost will be much cheaper than that of the S3 standard. So we will be looking into the pricing details a bit later, but now think of that as S3 standard infrequent access. By the term infrequent access, that means that you can wait for some period of time to get the data available. So that means once you store the data in infrequent access, you need to wait for some time to get the access. So that's the infrequent access. So that there will be a slight delay in that. Then there is another one, the infrequent access class, which is similar to the standard which we discussed, but limited to on zone, which is called S3 on zone infrequent access. Here it's also similar to the S3 standard infrequent access, but it's limited to just a single availability zone, but it will be less expensive, but with a trade-off, the availability will be reduced. Like if you look into the S3 infrequent access, even though there will be a slight delay and in retrieving the data, but still the data is stored across different availability zones, ensuring that it will be highly available. But if you want to further reduce the expense associated with storage, then S3 on-zone infrequent access, like we discussed, can offer, but with the reduced trade-off of availability reduced to a single zone. So this is also suitable for some cases like the example archiving old marketing campaign data, or if you want to store less critical log files or something, then this can be a better choice for that. Then now coming to the archiving, like if you don't want to access some data and even if you want to access some data, you can still wait for, if you are okay to wait for a certain hours or days, then S3 offers different Glacier type classes. In Glacier, there are 3 different classes, like the Glacier Instant Retrieval, So this is suitable for very long term archival storage where you need immediate access to data, but you don't require any high performance or anything. So this is ideal for regulatory compliance, legal holds and media archives. Example, like if you want to store some historical financial records or archiving medical imaging data for long-term retention, then Glacier archive S3 Glacier instant retrieval can be used for that purpose. Now the problem here is like once you store something like in the S3 Glacier, the data won't be readily available. That means that whenever you want to have that data, you need to initiate the data request, and it will take some time depending upon the 3 different classes that are available within the S3 Glacier. It will take some time to process that initiation, and then it will AWS will restore the data behind the scenes, and once it is available, you can access that data, but it will take, depending upon the type of Glacier storage that you selected, it will take some time. For example, the S3 Glacier Deep Archive, it's one of the very lowest cost option for long-term archiving and digital preservation. But if you want to get the data from that S3 Glacier Deep Archive, you need to initiate a request and then needs to wait for a couple of hours, like hours or maybe a day. So exact time for the Glacier Deep Archive can be identified from the documentation. So ideally it will be more than a couple of hours, and then or maybe a day or two, and then you need to wait for that. And also there is a storage cost associated with the Glacier classes, like you need to pay anyway, you need to pay for that storage cost even if you are not storing the data. So minimum time is like in the Deep Archive case it will be like 180 days, but in the case of Glacier instant retrieval and S3 Glacier retrieval, it will be like 90 days or something. So depending upon the cases, you can choose like the frequently accessed case, you can go for S3 standard or S3 Express one zone. If you have a need for less frequently accessed enterprise data, then you can have S3 standard infrequent access, or if you can if you are happy with the trade-off of limitation to on zone, then S3 on zone infrequent data access is there. And also in the case of archiving the data, where you are sure that you don't need the data for a certain period of time, then and if you're okay with that, then the lowest cost storage option is available, which is called the Glacier classes. And within the Glacier itself, there are multiple of other types as well. This list goes on ever changing, so it will be recommended to look into the AWS documentation. Now the deepest one, like the Glacier Deep Archive, have something like a 180 days minimum storage time required. So if you are trying to access the data before that period of time, first of all you need to initiate that request, and then you need to wait for a couple of hours, and also there will be a cost associated with that for retrieving the data, in case if you are retrieving the data before that. So if you can ensure that it will be stored for a minimum storage time, then and you don't need the data, then storing the data is the thing. So out of all these different storage classes, when choosing a storage access, you need to ask a few things like how frequent you want to access the data, and how much speed or how much quickly you need access to the data, then how much durability and availability of data. Like I mentioned earlier, when we saw the infrequent access on zone related classes, we saw that the availability is reduced to one single zone. So if your concern is of availability, then in that case you need to go for standard rather than the on-zone type, and how much you are willing to pay for storage. So if you cannot afford to pay for this standard cost, and if you can reduce if you are okay to compromise the availability, then you can go for the on-zone availability options. Now there are certain cases where you are not sure what type of class will be chosen. In that case, you can choose for a class called the S3 intelligent tiering. That's another class which is available. It's actually not a class in particular. It's like a kind of a monitoring class where you can select that option, S3 intelligent tiering. So what it happens is AWS will analyze depending on your usage patterns. So if you have a different kind of changing access patterns where you are not sure where to store the data, in which class you have to store the data. So in the case of unknown and frequently changing patterns, then the S3 intelligent tiering option can be used. And in some blogs and some cases, I have seen majority of the AWS experts were saying if you're not sure about which one to choose, then still S3 intelligent tiering would be a good choice. Then the problem with that is selecting the intelligent tiering is that there will be a slightly monitoring cost associated with that. So if you have a lot of files, like more than 4,000 or 5,000 file, then this monitoring cost would be an additional overhead for you. So that's why it says, like, if you know what kind of data you want to store, and if you know or if you can predict that access patterns, then it might be better to store that in the associated classes like S3 standard or anything. But again, if you are not sure about which one to use, then the intelligent tiering can be used. But keep in mind that while intelligent tiering can save a lot of cost, it can identify the pattern, and it can move the objects to different classes based on the pattern. But again, it has a small monthly monitoring fee per object. It's charged per object. For extremely large data sets with very infrequent access, then if you are sure that you can store that in the S3 Glacier, then rather than selecting this intelligent tiering, directly storing that inside that class will be much beneficial. So there is a pricing calculator available within the AWS documentation, which you can use to calculate these costs based on the pattern. So you need to identify when you want to access that data. If you want a frequent access, then standard must be the only way to go ahead. Now the cost is like, if you look into the cost, if you look into the frequently accessed classes like S3 standard and S3 express on zone, we could see like the S3 express on zone has a cost like around it's a bit higher, on a very higher side rather than the S3 standard. Now we have to evaluate the different criteria. Like S3 standard offers high availability by storing the multiple copies of data in 3 different availability zones, whereas in S3 express on zone you need to pay a bit extra than the S3. But again, the availability is still reduced to just on zone, on just a single availability zone. But the benefit there you are getting is like a very low latency, high speed availability is there. Availability of data is there, which can be used for real time analytics and high frequency trading and interactive gaming. Now, if you look into the less frequently accessed enterprise data, there are two classes there, like the S3 standard infrequent access and S3 on-zone infrequent access. Now here the S3 on-zone infrequent access have lower cost than the S3 standard infrequent access, because here there's no benefit in like the speed or anything, or latency or anything, but again the availability is reduced just to on zone, and because of that it got a bit lesser cost than the other one. So there will be a retrieval fee. So that means this less frequently accessed enterprise data class should be used only if you are sure that you don't want to retrieve the data often, because there will be a retrieval fee associated with that. In the case of intelligent tiering, the pricing model varies, like depending upon whatever type of data and whatever type of patterns that you have within your buckets within that objects. Then depending upon that, the intelligent tier class will move the data to different other classes. So it can move data to maybe frequent access tier or infrequent access tier, or archive cases or deep archive cases, and once it moves the data, then that will be charged there. But there is an additional monitoring and automation fee per object, that is like a very, very minimal charge. But when it comes to very large data sets, then this minimal can add up to a certain amount. So you must be considering when you select the intelligent tiering, make sure that there won't be much data set there. Then when it comes to the pricing model for the Glacier classes, then the deep archive has the lowest cost, like it has only it's a fraction of the storage cost of the standard one, but there will be a retrieval fee associated with that. So these are some of the different classes that we could see when it comes to the management features within the AWS S3. Now there are cases where when you store the data, you are not sure which class should you choose. Like when you initially upload some data, it should be accessed frequently, but after 1 month or something, then you reach a situation where you don't want that data. In that case, there is an option like you can leverage the S3 lifecycle rules. So lifecycle rules are simple rules, like you mention a rule where you want the data to transition from one class to another class. So that means if your object, you are storing an object inside a bucket, and if you are accessing for the first 2 days, and then after that you are not going to access that, then you can set a lifecycle rule, like after 30 days move this object to and different classes like infrequent or deep archive or whatever you prefer. So lifecycle rules can be used for that purpose. When it comes to lifecycle rules within the S3, there are main two types, like transition accounts and expiration accounts are there. Transition action means the one which we just discussed, like if you want to transfer the if you want to change a storage class from one type to another one, from standard to infrequent or standard to deep archive or something, then you can set the transition one. So that means that you can have multiple rules as well. So for example, after 30 days you can move that to standard, from standard to infrequent access, and after 90 days you can move that same object to the S3 Glacier or deep archive, or after 180 days you can move that to the deep archive. So different life cycle rules and the transition actions can be set there. You can also delete the objects based on the life cycle rules, and there you will set the expiration actions. So rather than moving one object to a different one, you can set the expiration days, like after 180 days. If you want to delete the data, then you can have that through the expiration action of the lifecycle rules. So how the S3 lifecycle rules work is like you will define the lifecycle rules at the bucket level, or for some specific object prefixes, that if you know a prefix. So even though the S3 doesn't support any hierarchical or structure based for structure like formats, then still you can have a prefix like it resembles similar to the folder structure. You can have a prefix there, and if you in the lifecycle rules you can specify that object prefixes. So what it does is, once you set that rules, S3 automatically scans your buckets periodically to identify any objects that meet the specific lifecycle rules, and S3 automatically performs the actions specified in the rules. So depending upon your rules action type, like if you want to transition objects to a different storage class or to expire them or delete them, S3 will do that behind the scenes. There are certain limitations also, like you can have a rules up to 1000 rules per bucket. Rules can be complex. Then S3 doesn't guarantee immediate execution of the lifecycle action. That means that sometimes even though you split the lifecycle rules, still you need to wait for a certain period of time. Then there is no versioning support for expiration. That means that if you have a versioning enabled on your bucket, lifecycle rules for expiration will only add a delete marker to the current version of the object. So this is happened for the version 1. So we will discuss about the version later. So there are some best practices for S3 lifecycle rules, like you can start simple, begin with the simple rules and gradually add complexity as needed. Then for better management, use prefixes, like I mentioned earlier. Even though there is no hierarchical structure you can set within the S3, still you can use prefix and manipulate that. So organize your objects using prefixes to apply lifecycle rules to specific subsets of data. Then another one best practice is, like if you are not sure about any access pattern or predictable access patterns, then consider using S3 intelligent tiering, which automatically moves object between tiers based on the different frequency. Now there are certain limitations in addition to that, like for the S3 lifecycle transition rules. So the rules have different types, like I mentioned earlier, the expiration and the transition. You can transition from one class to another, and you can expire the object. When it comes to transition, you cannot transition objects to a different storage class immediately after creation. So there is a minimum object age requirement for each storage class transition. We saw different storage classes, and each storage classes has different minimum object age requirements. Only once that reached that criteria, then only you can move the data. So when it comes to S3 intelligent tiering, there is no minimum age, but if we are using S3 standard, IA and infrequent access, and S3 on-zone infrequent access. So this is for the infrequent access class, and if you are storing data there, then you need to wait at least 30 days for that to happen. So only after that period, then it will move to the next one. Then if you store something in the Glacier deep archive, and if you set something to delete from there, then the minimum storage duration for the deep archive is 180 days, means that you cannot delete the data using a lifecycle rule before that period, that is 180 days. Then the transition frequency is that even if you set rules, you can only schedule one transition per object per day. If you have multiple rules that could apply to an object, only the first matching rule will be executed each day. Then when you enable the version we will discuss later, but if you enable the version, then the lifecycle transition rules only apply to the current version of an object. If you have version enabled, older versions will not be transitioned automatically. You would need to create separate rules to manage non-current versions. So that's another limitation. Then when it comes to uploads in S3, like the incomplete multiple uploads, life cycle transitions won't apply to objects that are in the process of being uploaded or uploaded using multi-part uploads. The transition will only occur after the upload is completed. Then the tag-based limitation is like tag-based limitation for the transitions. It's like, while you can use tags to filter objects for lifecycle rules, you cannot use tags to trigger transitions directly. The transition criteria must be based on an object age or a specific date. Then there are also some cost considerations also, like while you transitioning objects to a lower cost storage classes, it can save money, but the thing is like there is a transition cost associated between the storage classes. Also, when you move data to the deep down into the storage classes like the S3 Glacier deep archive, then there is a minimum storage duration there, and if you try to access the data before that period, there will be a retrieval cost associated with that. In addition to that, you also need to wait for a certain period of time, so that means those data won't be readily available. So now we will be looking into the next part of the discussion, which is the S3 versioning. So versioning is a simple feature. It's easy to understand if you are aware of the versions in Microsoft Word and Excel, where if you modify an object, it will be kept as a separate version. So that means multiple version of the object, a similar object is created in the same bucket if you enabled the version. So it will preserve all the older version. The advantage you would be getting is like if you want to go to a previous version, you can have that. So what happen when you enable the S3 versioning is like each version of an object is assigned a unique version ID. And when you enable version on a bucket, all new objects and their subsequent updates are versioned. So even if you delete an object, S3 will still keep the previous version. So this is for the version enabled objects. So S3 will still keep the previous versions and creates a delete marker. You can restore the objects to a previous version by removing the delete version. So now if you enable the version, what happens is like the storage consumption will be increased because the S3 needs to store multiple versions of the object. That means if you have a 10 MB of storage which you want to store in the S3, if you haven't enabled the version, then the 10 MB plus the metadata, certain storage also it will be consumed by the S3. And then if you enable the S3 versioning, and then if you make changes to that object, then again the copies are created. That means if it's initially 10 MB and if you make 2 changes later, then the extra 20 MB or 30 MB will be added depending upon that. So that means the cost will be increased, storage will be increased. So versioning is versioning should be used only for critical data and for regulatory compliance or collaborative workflows where multiple persons are working, and if you don't want a data loss to happen, then versioning can be enabled, but it will come at a at additional cost. So if there are cases where your enterprise doesn't want additional cost, and cost is a major concern, then the versioning is not good. And also for static data where the object is not updated or rarely updated, then enabling the versioning is not required at all. Then if you enable the version, then it can help in compliance and object load, because compliance is directly related to the ensuring the different versions. So if someone deleted the file, if you enable the version, you can restore it back, which can be a compliance requirement for some organizations. Data retention, recovery, and audit trail, these are all compliance requirements for some organizations. And if you enable the version, then you can have compliance requirements. Then you can enable the object log. So what happens is, object logs build on versioning to create a warm model for your data. Once an object version is logged, it cannot be overwritten or deleted for a specified retention period. So this means that it becomes an immutable data. If you enable the object log on an object, then it will remain tamper proof, that is compliant with the regulations of the organization. Then when you enable the object log, it has two modes, like the governance mode and the compliance mode. Governance mode allows authorized users to alter or delete logged objects under specific conditions. So this is based on a conditioned object logs. This is governance mode. Then the compliance mode is there, which provides stricter protection, preventing anyone, including the root option, for altering and deleting logged objects during the retention period. So if you so mainly the object log is used for the compliance purpose, where if you have a governance mode type of, then certain users can delete it based on a condition, but at the same time, if it's in a compliance mode, then no one can alter that during the retention period. Now so these are some of the main things which we plan to discuss in today's episode. In addition to that, just a quick overview into some of the security features in AWS S3. Security, when it comes to security, three types of security mechanisms can be used. One is the IAM, or the Identity and Access Management. If you want to have a centralized security in place, practice which you need to ensure, then IAM is the one thing which is recommended. Then there are certain bucket policies. There are certain other types of policies as well, which can ensure security, like the resource policies or bucket policies, and the access control list. So bucket policies are actually another type of policy which are attached to that specified buckets. So they define a set of rules and that determine who can access that bucket and what actions they can perform. So bucket policies are more powerful and flexible than ACL, allowing for complex access control scenarios based on various conditions. Then in addition to that, there are access control lists also. These are legacy access control mechanisms that can be applied at the bucket or object level. They grant permissions to specific AWS accounts or predefined groups. So ACLs are less granular than IAM policies and bucket policies, and generally not recommended for majority of the cases. So the AWS recommended to use the roles, especially if you have a set of services within the AWS to connect with each other. Roles are the better option. Roles in IAM, you can create roles. In other cases, IAM policies and bucket policies. Bucket policies is similar to resource policy. These are the recommended mechanisms for controlling access to S3 resources. So I think we have covered the enough of the things. We started with an understanding about the S3. Then we looked into the different classes like the standard classes, infrequent classes, and the archive related classes like the Glacier. Then we also discussed about the intelligent tier, which can help to automatically monitor and identify the pattern, but it comes at a monitoring cost and not recommended for data sets with large data sets. Then we discussed about the different life cycle transitions, where you can set the transitions based on you can set the life cycle rules for transition from one class to another, and to expiration actions in life cycle. Like if you want to delete something based on a condition, you can do that. But there are certain limitations, like there is a minimum storage time there which are set for certain classes. So until then you cannot delete. That means, for an example, if you set something in deep archive and if you want to set it delete, then you need to wait for 180 days to delete that object belonging to that class. Then we saw the need for versioning to ensure the compliance and other cases where people work in a collaborative manner need to ensure that the data remains there. So for that purpose, versioning can be enabled, but it comes at a cost, because the multiple copies of your data or object should be stored along with the metadata. Then we also discussed about the concept of compliance mechanism, where you can set different compliance ways, like the governance mode and compliance mode. Governance mode means that based on a condition, and if someone satisfies that condition, they can delete it. But the compliance mode ensure that until the retention period, it cannot be deleted at all. So these are some of the things. Then another one thing worth mention here, it's related to the lifecycle rule, is that even though you can transition from one lifecycle role to you can use the lifecycle rules to transition from one class to another one. There are limitations when it comes to certain classes. For example, if you moved something into the deep archive class, you cannot use the lifecycle rules to bring it back again to the standard class. For that, if you want to bring it back again to the standard class, what you need to do is you need to initiate a request to restore that object, and once it is initiated, you need to copy it and paste it again into the standard class, which means that it incurs a certain set of retrieval cost from the Glacier as well as the storage cost. All of these things are documented in the AWS documentation. So with that, I planning to wind up this episode. Thanks everyone for listening and tuning into Coding Talks. There will be more sessions coming up related to network and other things related to AWS. Please stay tuned. So thanks once again.